And greetings everyone. In this lecture, let's talk about Terraform ephemerals and write-only arguments. I tried to make this guide as practical as possible, so without further ado, let's just jump into it. First of all, let's see what problem we're trying to solve, and let's see it in action. Let's read some sensitive data using Terraform. For that purpose, we'll use a SSM parameter data source, which would reference an SSM parameter with a sensitive value. And the question is, would this data source expose our SSM parameter with a sensitive value to the Terraform state? Well, to find out, let's inspect the Terraform state. And as you can see, that is quite bad, but here is our secret value from that SSM parameter. So the data source essentially exposed our sensitive value that we should have kept secret. And to make things even worse, the resources would expose our secrets too. Let's take a look at this example. Here I create a random password, then I put it into an SSM parameter using the resource block. And in the Terraform state, the same sensitive value is displayed as plain text for each resource. So here it is in the random password, and here it is in the SSM parameter. And this is quite bad because we have the same sensitive value all over the place, and anyone who can access our Terraform state can access the sensitive value in this SSM parameter. And so it begs the question, what should we do to keep our values private and not exposed to our Terraform state? Ideally, we want to have only one copy of the sensitive value in that SSM parameter. And as you might have already guessed, to avoid exposing our secrets, we should be using ephemeral blocks and write-only arguments. And if you don't know what they are, let's discuss it. Here's a little theory on ephemeral blocks. And ephemeral blocks are resources that only live throughout the plan. And with each new plan, the ephemeral resource is recreated. So if you were to create a random password with an ephemeral block, the new password would be generated for each plan. And ephemeral blocks are useful because they prevent leaking of sensitive data in the state, because they are not stored in the state, they only live throughout the plan. The common uses of an ephemeral blocks are, as a data source, we can fetch some sensitive data, perhaps an SSM parameter, or a secret manager on a var vault, etc., etc. We'll see it in the next slide. And we can use it in conjunction with the write-only argument. For instance, for creating a secret from an ephemeral resource. We'll see about write-only arguments later in this lecture. Here's how we can read the data using the ephemeral block. Here's our old data source. And let's switch from data to ephemeral. Here's our ephemeral block with seemingly the same functionality. Let's apply and check the state, and the state is empty, as if no resources were created, because there weren't any resources created. As I explained earlier, the ephemeral block exists only at the plan time. Therefore, it isn't stored in the state. Ephemerals are never written to the state, in fact, they only exist at plan or apply time, unlike other resources or data sources. So you may think that data sources are no longer needed because ephemeral seems to be much more safer, but here's a little disclaimer. Ephemeral values can only be passed to write-only attributes. We'll still need data sources, and we'll look into write-only attributes a little bit later, but in this lecture, I promise you. And now let's create a resource, but before we do so, let me introduce another concept called write-only attribute, finally. It allows us to only write some value without it being visible in the state. Let me show you what I mean. Here is our SSM parameter with the regular value. And in order to make it a write-only, we'll change the value to value write-only and add something called a write-only version. We'll discuss what it does and why is it needed in this presentation. Now let's apply a write-only. Here's how it looks in the state, or rather the plan. Here is it in the plan. As you can see, the value write only is written as write only attribute. And in the state, as you can see, there is no value declaration. So the value is not displayed, and the value write only is replaced to null. The only thing that we can get from this state is something called write only version. And the version below it is the version of an SSM parameter. So what is a write only version, you ask? Basically, a rule of thumb, the write only attribute is updated only when the version number is updated. This is done because Terraform cannot read the actual value back, since it is not present in the state, as I showed in the previous slide, and therefore it cannot detect the drift. So with each new update to the write only version, the value write only is updated. So if we were to update the value write only, we should also change the version to actually trigger the update. Therefore, we have to change the write only version when we want to write another value in the write only attribute. Like for instance, when you do a password rotation or something. And let's combine what we know so far about ephemeral and write only. So ephemerals are the resource that only live throughout the plan, and they are not persisted to the state. And write only attributes allow us to create resources without exposing the value to the state. And if we combine those two together, there would be no sensitive data leaked to the state. Let's see how it will work. And for that, I'll create a little demo. First of all, we'll create a random password in SSM. For that matter, we'll generate a random password using an ephemeral block. And then we would write this password into the value write only attribute to the AWS SSM parameter resource. Notice that this ephemeral block is recreated on each and every plan, but written only once. That's because the value write only version is not going to change between those plans, and therefore if we were to change this password to a different one, all we have to do is update the value write only version, and that would trigger a password change. Okay, fair enough. Now let's create a database using this password. For that, we'll fetch this AWS SSM parameter in which our password is located in, and pass it to a database instance using a password write only attribute. So the actual RDS instance resource also supports the write only attribute. And as a version, the SSM parameter version would be used. So this is not the write only version, it is the SSM parameter version. Those are different things. Why do we do it this way? That's because we want to database to be updated when the SSM parameter is updated. So when the SSM parameter is updated with a new password, the database would also be updated to the different password. That's because we use an SSM parameter as a version for this write only attribute. And in this example, the password would only be displayed in SSM. It is not visible in the Terraform state. Well, that's because we have ephemeral block here, and here we use the write only attributes. None of those are visible in the state. The password would be visible only in the SSM parameter. Here's also a little disclaimer about ephemeral and write only attributes. The ephemeral cannot be used with a non-write only attribute. So in this example, for instance, we create an AWS SSM parameter and pass in a value an ephemeral, the ephemeral password, which is recreated on each plan, as I already mentioned. So what you would expect is the Terraform would replace the value in this SSM parameter on each and every plan. But what actually would happen is Terraform would deny this call That's because ephemeral values are not valid for value, which is this one, because it is not a write-only attribute and it must be persisted to the state. So the Terraform would not allow you to write ephemerals to attributes which are persisted to the state, which are non-write-only attributes, as I already mentioned. Keep that in mind when working with ephemerals. And at last, a little postscriptum. So ephemerals were introduced in Terraform 1.10, and write-only arguments were introduced in Terraform 1.11. And if for some reason your Terraform installation doesn't have those features, there's a good chance that you're using an outdated version. Those are experimental features, at least as of now, and only largest providers have a support for them. Those are, of course, the big three cloud providers, AWS, GCP, and Azure, and some others, which are obviously very popular, Kubernetes and Vault. Not all modules currently support those features, and this is the biggest one, I think, in this list. That's because providers try to pin down to the earliest as possible Terraform version, which is roughly around 1.6 or 1.5 in my observations. But let's wait. Hopefully they will implement those features soon enough. The code for this lecture would be at my GitHub. The link is in the description, and stay safe. I'll see you in the next lecture.